with holidays and our emotional feelings that we have towards going abroad and having holidays on the one hand, and climate change on the other hand. I'm not going to give you a full lecture in this hour. What I would like to do is give you some insights, I think 5-6 slides, and then really go into a discussion. Would like to have your personal opinion of how you deal with flying. There might be good arguments to fly. There are, of course, some arguments not to fly. And then in the second part, actually in the third part, to go into solutions. So actually, what can we do to solve this challenge? But to start with some information, yeah, coming from sustainability and coming from tourism, really the biggest challenge of tourism that we have, the biggest critical impact of tourism is the negative climate impact. And just imagine that flying once a year, let's imagine that you do some holidays in Thailand. So you fly from Zurich to Bangkok and back. This trip personally emits as much CO2 as you should emit in 2 years. So if you have holidays in Thailand, you wouldn't be allowed, if you would like to stay in this not more than 2 degrees Celsius goal that we have, you wouldn't be allowed to drive a car for 2 years. You wouldn't be allowed to heat your flat for 2 years. You would only be allowed to eat vegetables from your own garden without any transport behind. Well, that's challenging. It's flying on the one hand, it's also driving own cars on the other hand. Again, from touristic side, 70% of all the holiday trips within Europe, or more than 80% within the Alps, are done by car. So especially in Switzerland, we do have a perfect public transport system, but still it's not really the main transport means of transport that we use for our holidays for today, but we're just focusing on flights. Tourism is also the only industry that still is increasing the emissions. All the other industries doing fine, more or less, but at least reducing, following the different international climate targets that we do have. But in tourism, we know that, and we're not talking about 2020 and the current situation, but if the tourism development that was seen till 2019 after the crisis is continuing around 2037, 2038, maybe 2040, we have doubled the amount of emissions that we had in 2010. Yeah, this is what I said. It's just, I mean, you can, of course, deal with different scenarios. We have a global growth scenario. This would be even more dramatic. This figure, 2037, is the business as usual scenario. But even if we have a kind of economic slowdown, which might be a result of the current crisis, there might be a huge increase in CO2 emissions by tourism, which is not the reason for that is not that we fly more often. Well, we do that. The reason is not that each single flight is emitting more. On contrary, every single flight is trying to emit less. That means the airplanes are getting more energy efficient by every new type of airplane. The reason for that is simply that more and more people are flying, and many people fly more often. And if you just look to tourism, we know that roughly 75% of all the emissions from tourism is related to the touristic transport, to mobility. This is our political goal. I mean, the original goal was saying that end of the century, we should reach zero in CO2 emissions. Now, the new political goal is that also in Switzerland, also in the EU, climate targets by the Paris Treaty is that in 2050, we reach a net zero, so a climate neutral industry. And this is, of course, also relevant for tourism. So the target for tourism is that in around 30 years, we have zero emissions. At the moment, we don't have any roadmap for that. We have no master plan for that. And we know if we continue the development of tourism as it was done in the last 10, 15 years, that by around 2045, only tourism is responsible for the full amount of emissions that we would be allowed to emit if we follow this political climate target. And as I said, the main reason is more people travel. this is mainly due to a better economic standard in the large countries, in the BRIC countries. So it's in the emerging countries. So it's China, India, Brazil, who has a population that more and more is used to go on holidays, to go abroad on holidays, to go longer distances on holidays. So the number of flights is mainly increasing there. People traveling over larger distances, this is also valid for us. I mean, if we look back to the development from the 70s, the Europeans started with more or less domestic tourism, then going to the neighboring countries, maybe Italian coast, Spanish coast. And then in the 90s, it became really popular to go to Southeast Asia, for example, for holidays. And every single holiday trip in general becomes more energy intense. This is also a challenge for the so-called ecotourism, because ecotourists have usually a more energy intense holiday, because also within the destination, they use maybe some additional short distance flights to reach some remote areas where they want to visit some national parks. So it's not always the case that ecotourism is at the end also more environmentally or climate friendly. If you go to political figures and figures from literature, you might find the saying that, well, tourism is just responsible for plus minus 5% of the global emission. That's actually not the full picture. First, this is an old source that was always quoted. Actually, it's coming from UNWTO, UNEP, and WMO, the Meteorological Organization, but it's already more than 12 years old. So newer studies done in 2018 in Australia, we're talking simply by the increase of touristic emissions, we're already talking about 8% of the global CO2 emissions. This was a very, very comprehensive, very good study, having all data from more than 180 countries. But again, this is not the full picture. If you follow Stefan Gößling and Paul Peters, two famous researchers focusing very much on sustainable tourism and here on the climate impact of tourism, they're talking about the fact that tourism and the touristic mobility has 12 to 15% of the global climate impact. What's the difference here? The difference is that the two first figures, the 5% and the 8%, are just calculating the amount of emissions based on the amount on the ground. But if you fly, the largest proportion of your emissions that you're responsible for then is done in the flying altitude, 10,000 meters. And the climate impact in that altitude of the same amount of CO2 is much higher than this amount would be emitted on the ground. So you have to use a multiplier. This is usually 2.7, sometimes 3. And this at the end, if you really calculate the climate impact, and it's at the end, it's the impact that's important, not the amount of CO2. And some other greenhouse gases, if you do not only focus on CO2, then you come up with a figure 12 to 15%. This already sounds a little bit more heavy than just 5%. So there is definitely the demand that we change something. What can we do? And who is going to do what? And what's the possibility that we have? I mean, what you see here is the upper part, the CO2 budget that we still have, that we still can emit to be able to reach this climate goal in 2050. And of course, the amount of CO2 per year should decrease constantly till 2050 to be able that in 2050 we reach this zero. On the other hand, we also know that the world population is still growing and will grow between now and 2050. So actually we need to decrease our personal CO2 emissions more than just dividing it by the amount of people that we have by now. This calculation come up at the end with a roughly budget per person of 2.3 tons of CO2, 2,300 kilograms of CO2 per person and year. And as mentioned here, one flight from Frankfurt to Dubai and back is already exceeding that personal amount. And if you fly from Zurich to Bangkok and back, it's even more exceeding. This was the example from before. And of course, we have different average CO2 emissions per person in year, dividing, looking on different world regions. I mean, a person in India at the moment is just emitting or responsible for the emission of 900 kilogram. In our society at the moment, we have an average of 11 tons per person and year. And there is still development ongoing, and we cannot deny the necessity that in several regions of the world, people are allowed to emit more than they do today. So an increasing industry is very important for the poor parts of our society. This, on the other hand, means that we need to reduce and we need to change our lifestyle even more radically than without that. So we need to reduce from 11 tons down to plus minus 2 tons. Now coming to the question is, how do we deal with flying? How do we deal with our need, our use that we are going on holidays more or less every year? And for that discussion, I would ask you to change to the Miro board that I mentioned here, and that just puts the link also into the chat. So then it's a little bit, okay, Sibyl already did that. And I change here to the Miro board. I'm not sure how many of you already worked with Miro. I mean, in the last year, I think many of us used a lot of different tools for online teaching, etc. So I hope that you're all familiar with Miro board. If not, the link stays here. And in the upper part, you will see also some playground where you can play around, something about what I would do if we would have a bit more time, kind of checking into the Miro system. I'm going to move to the first part and take you with me. So what you see here is a board with arguments. And of course, there are some arguments against flying. One of the main arguments I mentioned, CO2 and the climate change. You might find other arguments against flying, but you also might find some arguments in favor of flying. What I would ask you now in the next 15 minutes is, if you go with your mouse to one of the post-its on the left-hand side, you click on it. I shouldn't do it in the... If you click on it, you can move it, you can enlarge it, you can type on it. So please do that. Think some minutes about your arguments and then place your arguments both in favor of flying or against flying on the respective side of the board. And then I'm very curious what kind of arguments you're going to find. And please try not to delete the whole board in the meanwhile. Okay, some of you have some family living very, very far away. And doing everything in the virtual space is not enough. We urge to go back to personal meetings. If you click on your notes, you can grab one of the corners and then you can enlarge it a little bit, but I can do that as well for you. Thank you. Oh, there's some colleagues traveling with heavy baggage. And the argument against flying is that there's a maximum amount of baggage. Actually, that's half true, because you can always pay additional fee and then you can transport nearly as much as you want. It's not supporting domestic tourism. The costs. I mean, discussing low-cost carriers would be a separate workshop. It's not supporting domestic tourism. Yeah. Give you 2 more minutes. We go into discussion. Okay. Basically, would you think, and this is really a question to you now, would you think that staying at home is perfect sustainable holiday?
Honestly, well, this was a question for the round, right?
Yeah, but whoever wants to. Yeah, this was not a rhetoric question. This was really a question to the round. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, on the one hand, yes, of course, it is more sustainable just because you don't have the transportation cost. But for me, what traveling is really about is also understanding other cultures and understanding that there are more people on this earth than only my sole being, and to see how others are affected with other circumstances. And for me, traveling has always brought me to be more grateful on the one hand side, but also to be more active in certain parts of environmentalism. So yeah.
And this couldn't be replaced by virtual holidays. I mean, if you meet people from other cultures in the Zoom space or in the WebEx space, would that give enough insight? Would that be comparable with real holidays?
I'd love to say yes. I'd love to say I've had the exact same experience when talking to somebody online that I have talking with them in real, like, person by person. But honestly, I do not think so, because the things that I have experienced I really like some things I've experienced not while traveling, like not while leisure traveling, more of like doing documentary stuff for my future studies. And I wouldn't call that fun travel. But yeah, I would have never experienced some things like that online.
I fully agree. And staying at home is, in my understanding, not a sustainable form of holidays. I mean, it's definitely more environmentally friendly or climate friendly, but you miss it a lot. I mean, the cultural exchange is one thing, but at the end, I mean, if you take sustainability seriously, you have, of course, the environmental part, you have the cultural, social part, and you have the economic part. And people make an income by the fact that you visit them. And I do not know many people that staying at home and transferring some money to the destinations where they're not going to have their holidays. So yes, so staying at home is maybe not the best alternative. Okay, more flexibility with a train. Yeah, not supporting domestic tourism, noise pollution, that's clear. Spread of infectious diseases. I don't know who placed the sticky note there. Would you think that there's a difference if you go by train or if you take an airplane? Okay, maybe the person who placed that note here disappeared.
Maybe I can say something to that.
Yeah, sure.
Of course, even with the train, it spreads very quickly. But I think with the airplane, because you might move over continents, it's just a different dimension of how it spreads faster, maybe, and further.
It's an interesting point. On the other hand, I would say the possibilities of airplanes and airlines to control and to have high hygienic standards are easier to fulfill than in the whole train system. Okay. Make the way the destination. That's an interesting point. Who put it there? And what was the motivation here?
That was me.
Super, yeah. What's the idea?
The last time I flew is like 3 years ago now, and it was for me a city trip. Like I flew to Stockholm, I visited Stockholm for 4 days, and I flew back. And that was it. I mean, it was cool. Stockholm is a very nice city, but I made my semester abroad in Hamburg, and I traveled there by train. I traveled back by train. I traveled in Germany always by train, and I met so many people. I spent so much time talking to strangers. I would never do this in an airport or in a plane. I don't know if it's
Why not?
something I just don't do, but I think train traveling is just so much more personal, and it takes, you see so much more of the country you're traveling through than just sitting into an airplane and arriving in the city you want to visit.
Perfectly agree. The question is, I mean, you can take a train from Zurich to Hamburg, no problem. What about long distance holidays? I mean, if you want to spend a holiday in China, culturally very interesting country, would you take the Trans-Siberian train to go to Vladivostok or to Beijing?
I would love to. Yes. If I
How
have
many
the
of us
time,
would
yeah.
have the, yeah, exactly. The time comes in, and that was one of the arguments in favor of flying. It's simply the time question sometimes. How can we, but this is already going into solutions. We come back to that later. There was an interesting test by the Touch branch of the tour operator company. They wanted to offer a trip from Amsterdam to the Alps, actually to the Austrian Alps, by using a Zeppelin, and really making the way already part of the holidays. And at the end, they had some problems with the investor. And in the end, they didn't do that, but it was a very serious plan. So yes, some tour operators are already thinking about the idea, how they could avoid flying. I mean, the Zeppelin is also flying, but the CO2 emissions of a Zeppelin are comparable to a bus, more or less, per person. So it's much more energy efficient and much more climate friendly. So some tour operators are already thinking about they can change also their packages into something where the way to the destination and from the destination is actually part of the holiday. Okay, let's have a look to the left side. Fast traveling we already had, because we can. I would like to have an explanation for that sticky note. Okay.
I mean, I was just talking about that we have the possibility to explore the world so easily by flying and going somewhere far away so fast. So it kind of overlaps with traveling fast, maybe also cheap. And I think, yeah, it's just also that we have the possibility that maybe more people also tend to do it. If they want to see the world. And
that's definitely an explanation why we're flying, because it's possible and because we can. But is it an argument in favor of flying? So should we do it because we can? Should we do everything that we are able to do?
Maybe not so much, no.
Okay. The view from the airplane, that's of course a good argument. I mean, okay. This would be maybe a challenge to compensate this missing view from the airplane to some screens in the train or whatever, thinking about IT technology, what's possible to compensate that. But okay, I never thought about that argument, but simply enjoying the flight itself, having this great view, if the weather is fine, and you're not just flying in the middle of the clouds. Often it's cheaper than trains, for example. Why that? Why is it? It's true, but why?
It's me who wrote that, but I'm not sure why it's that cheap. I think it's also the, I don't know how to say in English, but the Konkurrenzkampf.
competition?
So that if one airline sets the price at, I don't know, $10, the other airline sets it at $8?
Mm-hmm. It's of course, it's more than that, and it's a complex issue. One part is that so far kerosene is not taxed. Kerosene is the only form of energy where the one who is using it does not pay any VAT or any other taxes. And there are heavy subventions for especially for the airports, more for the airports than the plane companies, airlines. And one other reason is that we accept a different buying system of the tickets. I mean, if we want to fly, we perfectly know usually the earlier we book, the cheaper the ticket is. If you go to a destination by train, you have a tendency very often to book in the very last moment. Also, the train companies have cheap tickets, special arrangements if you book early, or smaller groups, etc. So there is also the possibility for very, very cheap train tickets for longer distances, but we're simply not used to have the same booking behavior when we think about going by train as we use when we fly. Mm-hmm. Creation of jobs is an interesting argument. Why is this an argument in favor of flying compared to going by train, for example? Or is it just an argument basically instead of to fly instead of staying at home? Mm-hmm. Okay, no answer. Person disappeared. International working. Yeah, I mean, of course. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, also I am aware that only a fraction of workers work abroad, and even fewer work so far away that they cannot travel by train, but it is an argument. Also, if a person lives in Bern and wants to go to New York for two days in a week to work, they need a plane.
Why not having a Zoom meeting instead?
Yeah, it would also be possible.
Yeah, no, but I perfectly agree. I mean, I'm doing many international projects, and I mean, now after this crisis, I think the business trips will decrease very much because many companies realize that there is a lot of the short-term business and the short businesses that you could avoid simply by using virtual tools. But not everything, especially if you do not know the persons, especially if you rely on really interactive development. If you do some research, there are enough arguments for professional necessity to fly. Perfectly agree. The last argument here, research and development of new aircrafts takes time. Yeah, we have to accept that. Goes a little bit in line with supporting the aviation so that they have the revenue to create more sustainable means to fly. Yes, but I mean, the length of how long aircraft stay, I mean, usually they stay 20 years now. Lufthansa just sold some of the 25 years old machines, but they sold it to another company, so they're still in use then, maybe not in Germany. The question is simply, do we have the time to wait for that? And yes, there is development, and there is development of different types of fuel. So instead of kerosene, there might be some agrofuels coming. There is the development of not completely solar powered, but by using solar energy for some additional energy creation for the airlines and airplanes. But can we wait so long? That's the big question. Is anyone in the group saying, I'm not flying anymore because of climate reasons?
Yeah, me.
Okay, when did you decide so? How long is it ago?
Maybe last year. I was struggling already when I, as I said, flew to Sweden, but in an emergency case I would do it, but then would try to compensate it. I know it's not very like good to compensate, but I would at least do that then. But I will try to do all my travels by train and other transport.
This means that your holidays and your private trips will stay more or less within Europe, right?
Yes, or then for a longer time traveling into the direction of Asia and then maybe America. I don't know.
Okay. This creates demands to your employer. I mean, being a student, it might be rather easy to have a month time for traveling. Being employed somewhere, it's depending on the employer and then the circumstances, it's very often difficult really to travel for a long time in a row. So taking 4, 6 weeks, 5, 6 weeks holidays and then going by train to Southeast Asia, staying there, going back by train. So having really this climate-friendly behavior at the end demands also something from other sectors like the working conditions and legal requirements that maybe put some pressure on the employers in that respect.
Yeah, for me it's not very difficult to not go on holidays this far away because I never did that with my parents. We always stayed in Europe. We never flew. So for me, flying is already like a luxury, and so it's logical for me not to do it. It's not a very big change.
Seeing a flight as a luxury consumption, maybe it's one part of the solution, meaning flying not that often. We're already here with the solutions, and I'll just take you with me on the Miro board, going a little bit below. And we're now talking not about business trips, but we're really talking about our holidays. And I would again ask you to take some of the sticky notes and write some solutions. So what could we do? What's a possibility? Compensation was already mentioned. Staying longer maybe, or not traveling that often. And then place it in the matrix between having low impact or high impact. So what does it really make a difference if this is going to happen? And place it also between a low realistic acceptance. So will many people do that or not? Between low realistic acceptance and high realistic acceptance somewhere in the matrix. I see already long-term travels with middle impact and a rather low realistic acceptance or possibility. So take some minutes, think about and place your solutions somewhere. If someone is trying to move a big frame, that was not the idea, but don't worry, it's just a Miro board. You cannot delete anything. You cannot destroy anything, really. No,
it's the first time using the Miro board, sorry.
No, it doesn't matter. No,
struggling a bit with the stickers, but yeah. I hope I will get it.
Just make some of the notes a little bit larger. stop national flights. High realistic acceptance? That's Zurich, Geneva, and
I thought more about Germany there, for example.
yeah. But also flying from Zurich to Geneva is not really necessary.
But it exists.
It exists, yeah, of course.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Good afternoon. Hi.
Nice to be here.
Welcome.
I've been flying for Swiss in the last 4 years, and sorry that I flew more than 600 flights. And I wrote that up to 4 hours take the train. And I mean, Zurich, Geneva, it's of course not really efficient. And the reason why Swiss made those flights before the Corona was because a big part of the passengers who live in the Geneva area, they are very comfortable to fly first to Zurich. But now it's Swiss changed this. Now there's like an air train, and the airline is looking more for the environment that those passengers take the train with the SBB instead of flying. And what I learned from my 50 countries seen in the last years, for example, China, the infrastructure is getting better with the train and everything, but there are so many countries like also Russia. If you want to get from the east side to the west side of Russia, with a train it takes a lot of time. So sometimes the only decision you can take is fly or walk, but walking will take a long time.
Yeah, I would also, I mean, stop national flights should maybe be read in stop short distance flights. So whenever possible, because of course flying within Russia could be over China, could be over long distances. I agree on the point. I mean, up to 4 hours. I just as a kind of point could be also up to 5 hours. Take the train wherever possible. Mm-hmm. International taxing on kerosene, yes. Night trains. I mean, the night trains are really upcoming, and there is a big success story at the moment for the Austrian train company who runs several night trains, also in cooperation with SBB and the German train, and they're increasing the numbers of destination now, and they recently bought some new trains for the night trains. So this is again, after some years of big problems, it seems that there is more and more interest in that again. That's good. Short distance then only by train and bus, okay. More research about other transportation. What exactly do you mean? What kind of research and which other transportation would you?
Yeah, I wrote that. I think sometimes people just, for example, if they go to Vienna or Paris, they just take the plane because they don't know that, for example, the TGV is also very fast. So they just book a flight because it's the most comfortable one and because they have not done researches.
Okay, it's not scientific research. You simply mean the traveler should have more information, should look for other means of transport, so other possibilities. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Travel to the airport by train. Yeah. Also, this cooperation, as colleague mentioned, between train companies and the airlines, to have the smaller connecting flights that brings you actually to your long distance flights, and change that to the trains. That's ongoing. I mean, this Swiss does that. The Austrian is doing that. I've seen it also in Germany. So several of the larger airlines doing that, or at least in the Lufthansa group. Sustainable fuel. Okay, what do you exactly mean by that?
So I think there are a lot of ideas. For example, Lufthansa as well had I think it was called e-fuel project, where they test maybe Brandon, you need to help me. But of course, they test hydrogen to power aircrafts. Maybe as you mentioned before, maybe with electric fuel, maybe there's a chance to power airplanes as well. So I think if we focus on the research on sustainable fuel, I think there would be a chance that it is accepted, or that it is better accepted to fly, because yeah, that's the impact we now have at the moment with the kerosene. So if we could solve this problem, that would be a good step.
It will take quite a long time. That's the challenge here. The first step was done with several airlines and testing different agrofuels. But with the agrofuels, we have the problem or the challenge then in the production of that. It's often competing to food production. So there is also some counterproductive impacts. Hydrogen is at the moment not really a ready-made solution, as the energy that's used for the production of hydrogen that you then can use in the planes or also in the cars is still high. So you need a big amount of energy to produce the hydrogen. So a realistic, really more sustainable way of producing the energy would be the use of solar energy, which is not yet ready to really be. And there was some testing. I think Qantas tested a little bit with solar energy, but it's not really ready to be used in general. What's mentioned here, and I would like to discuss a little bit in depth, is there is very often a very skeptical approach to that, is the question of compensation. What is your opinion about CO2 compensation? I think you basically know the idea that you can pay some specific amount of money into a project, and in this project, the same amount of CO2 that you're responsible with your flight, or you can compensate also other things, is avoided.
I think it's on the one side, I think it's a good idea because, for example, for me, I try to not fly that often. So, for example, in Europe, my goal is to just take the train. So I would say for me, it's good if I have, or if I really want to go on holiday somewhere, I have to take the plane. It's good. But for example, for some people who don't want to change something in the behavior, and then they just do 5, 6, 7 flights a year, and they say, yeah, I mean, why should I do a flight less if I can compensate? So I think it's really dangerous for those people when they just say that, why should I change something?
Do you think there is a rebound effect? So would they fly more because of the possibility of compensation?
I would say, I'm sure that there are some people who say, yeah, I will fly more because I can compensate it. So yeah.
I have no figures about that. I personally don't think so. I mean, definitely the better option, the more climate friendly option at the end is not to fly. But then, in my understanding, the second best option would be compensation that is available at the moment would be compensation. But is anyone very critical about compensation? Do you have any arguments against that?
I just remember that once I read that you mentioned the CO2 in high altitudes, that it's destroying up there. The destruction is way higher than it would be CO2 pollution on floor, and that planting trees doesn't help reducing CO2 up in high altitudes.
I'm not talking about planting trees. There is a big and very, very critical discussion about planting trees as a compensation method for CO2 emissions. And Still, the overall opinion is that only under very, very, very specific conditions, planting trees would really be a method to compensate. There are several arguments against that. Most of the projects would go into more the industry side or the smaller industry side, really to avoid CO2 emissions. For example, financing wind energy or financing solar cookers in very dry areas for families that they don't need to cut the trees for burning the wood and then using the solar energy for cooking. So they're projects of very different dimensions, huge industrial projects or smaller ones. I think we need to see that the projects fulfill different conditions so that the compensation possibility is really a serious one. First, and there are many options on the market. In the booking process, in many websites, when you book a flight, after booking the flight, you come to an option to pay for an insurance, to book a rental car in your destination, etc. And then you very often find the possibility also to tick on that you pay some CO2 compensation. Very often here, the airlines using systems that do not calculate the CO2 impact in the flying altitude, but just the CO2 on the ground. So at the end, they are cheaper. So the first condition would be choose a serious possibility to compensate. For example, this would be in Switzerland, MyClimate, or in Germany, Atmosphere. They always have this multiplier in the calculation. So you pay at the end a higher amount, but you really compensate the climate impact and not just the CO2 emission. This would be the first condition. The second condition would be all our governments are obliged to reduce the CO2 emission. They need to follow the climate treaty. So till 2050, we should reduce anyway our CO2 emissions. So if we finance, being travelers, if we finance now a project that reduces the CO2 emission, for example, building some wind energy in Switzerland, at the end, the Swiss government could say, well, fine, we built some in our country, there was some wind energy nowadays, so we fulfilled our obligations. And actually, this would shift the obligations of the governments to the consumers. And there is a mechanism under the UN system called Cleaner Development Mechanism, CDM. And only if projects are developed under this CDM mechanisms, they are so-called additional projects. So then you have a project in a country, and this country cannot take this project as their contribution to the climate goals. And the last condition is the project should be sustainable, so it should not destroy the environment in another place, or it should not be socially unjust or whatever. And there's the so-called gold standard developed by WWF International and some others. And for example, MyClimate and Atmosphere only financing projects that are both according to the CDM standard and fulfilling the gold standard to be a sustainable project. And under these conditions, I would say compensation is a good method to compensate those flights that are not really necessary. Still, on the other hand, we should avoid those flights that are not really necessary. So far about compensation. Could you change your personal behavior? I mean, it was about staying longer, about reducing the number of flights, changing wherever possible from flights to taking the train or bus or bike or whatever. Is there anything else that comes to your mind what you personally could do? Okay. Well, I mean, if you follow those advices, that would be already a contribution to the climate goals. Do you personally think that we, all of us, that tourism manages still 2050 to be climate neutral?
It will be a very, very difficult, I just say it, target exactly. And it's a global target, not only Europe or specific area of the world. So the biggest problem I see, if you see how many people only in India live or in China and wherever, you have to talk to all of them. Everyone must be included. So if you see the aviation or only in India or China, that's crazy. Just check Flight Radar 24. It's an app where you can see how many flights there are. If you only think about Switzerland, I think we are doing a good thing. We are in a good way, but if we see it globally, it's very, very difficult till 2015.
I agree, but on the other hand, it's also the point that we shouldn't wait for the large countries to move. It's also our task. I mean, every country at the end has the task to reduce and to come down to climate neutrality at the end. So we should do also our part in that game.
Maybe I can.
I mean, this. Yes, please.
Just from the side of the consumer, I'm a bit afraid that when maybe the situation with Corona and traveling gets easier again, that there will be mass travels again and boom, because people have been locked at home and they want to travel and they felt like they had missed something. So I'm a bit afraid that this will be counterproductive from the consumer side. But maybe also it will be an opportunity for them to act more sustainably. I don't know.
I think both. On the one hand, I think some of us learned that also doing holidays in the own country or holidays in the neighboring country is quite interesting, and that there is to see and to experience new things. And a lot of those things, and some will keep that habit also in the next years. I mean, we know that some Alpine countries had the best summer ever in 2020, touristic-wise. And some of the new visitors in those destinations will learn that, but others will simply compensate with what they couldn't do in the last year. Yes. I think what's important is to make it easier for the consumers to choose also, for example, the compensation option. This would be, for example, one task for the airlines having this in the booking process, to have an opt-out thing instead of the opt-in. So the consumer would need to actively choose that he does not want to compensate. Instead, now they have to actively choose that they do compensate. Or some of the tour operators already started to include the compensation into the travel package price and have very good experiences with that. We have 12 German tour operators who did that in the last 5 years. And they had very good experience in terms of very good reputation. No single consumer was really complaining about the fact that they increased the prices of, depending on destination, of course, of between 50 and 100 euros. So they could even use it for marketing. And having this on the agenda also for the large tour operators to include the compensation into the packages. Not every holiday is booked as a package or sold as a package, but especially in the long distance trips, a large proportion of holidays is sold as package. So you could increase the money that's going into compensation projects. So there are many tools, and we need to think about nudging, about stimulating the consumers to act more environmentally friendly and to compensate or to stay longer. So it's a shared task between the tourism industry, the businesses, the government to act, to give some regulations, the tourists to act accordingly and more environmentally friendly, and the destinations also to motivate people to come by public transport. And at the end, also the question for the destination: do we need to focus on the long distance market? So is Switzerland necessarily focusing on the Chinese market in the next years, on the Indian market? or might there be also some closer markets in Europe that are interesting for the Swiss tourism? But now we're leaving a little bit the question personally, if we should fly or not. Well, it's 2 minutes to 6. We are quite good in time with our discussion. Is there anything else that you would like to add or to question or to comment? We had some suggestions in the chat, using the paraglide, for example, to have the airplane view.
Maybe for me, one big question is how many people, or what's the percentage of people, maybe you know, Christian, are really ready to reduce their behavior, their flying, and how many people will continue after the corona epidemic with what has been done before. And I'm quite skeptical. Also, we have some people here in the video conference who are maybe ready to reduce their flying, but I think most people are not ready.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the last part, the second part of the question, what the people really will do after the corona crisis, no one can really answer. Yeah, we never had such a crisis or any crisis that's comparable with this crisis. So we really don't know what the consumers will do afterwards. We have some figures about the basic availability of reducing the flights and or paying compensation. And at the moment, we have a compensation rate of around 2%. So only 2% of the flights are compensated. And here it's mainly the business flights where the companies have the policy to compensate. But the point here is really the communication. Many of the consumers simply do not know about the possibility to compensate. And for many, it's far too difficult to go then to the website of Atmosphere, My Climate, and to tick on to do that. So making that easier would be really one challenge. And we have some figures from the German market that up to 20% say, well, if it's easy for me, I would be ready to compensate. At least 20%. I mean, and of course, if it's included then in the package price, you do not ask the consumer at the end, but you simply compensate. And for general change from private car to public transport, we have another figure. It's more than 50% of the consumers. This was in parallel done on the British market and on the German market. More than 50% of the consumers say they would be ready to change from private car to public transport if they would receive a small incentive. This might be a reduction in the cost for the overnight stay. This might be a nice welcome package, whatever. Yeah. So here the hotels and the destinations really need to work on some smaller incentives to motivate people to change. Yeah. Only a part of the answer, or only a part of the question was answered by that, but yeah, that's what I know.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to ask you, what do you think when we see the pre-corona time of aviation in the whole world? How long do you think it will take that we come back like to the same level? I mean, in aviation industry, they talk about 3 to 4 years. And if I ask people in the street or friends in general, what do you want to do after Corona? It's mostly, I want to travel. So yes, and I mean, a big part, they want to travel to the beach. Well, Switzerland's a little bit difficult. So with the train, it's of course possible. I totally agree with that. But if I hear from someone, I have 2 weeks of vacation and I want to go to the Caribbean Sea or something. I mean, yeah, do you think aviation will come back, and how long this will take to the pre-label Corona time?
I mean, all the dates that we hear coming from the aviation industry is that they talk about 2024, 25. That's the expectation. It's also the expectation of World Tourism Organization in that respect. One point is that the business trips will definitely decrease. So the number of business trips, so this part of the business will decline on the one hand, and on the other hand, we do not know how quick we really handle this crisis. I mean, it's on the one hand our end of the story. So when are we ready to fly again? But on the other end, it's also the other destinations. If you look to African countries or South American countries, when will they be ready to receive tourists again? And the other question is then, what did we learn from that crisis? Are we ready for the next crisis that might come then in I don't know, 5 to 10 years? I mean, similar crisis or really health crisis by any other virus.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if this really answered your question, but again.
I mean, it's a totally difficult question, but I want to hear your opinion about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so then in this case, I hand back to Sydney. And finally, after the second session, at the end, I learned that her name is Sydney and not Sibylle, as I mentioned several times. Sorry, Sydney, for that.
No worries, it's okay. Yeah, I would just share my screen again. Can you see it?
Yes, now. Yep.
Okay, yeah. Christian, I really want to thank you. I think I can speak from all participants. It was really interesting, and also the discussion. And I also want to thank the others. I think I could really learn something, and I always find it interesting when other people give some inputs. And I just wanted to say again that this event was under the Sustainability Week in Switzerland and is organized by Student Hub, and we are looking for members. So if you are really into the sustainable topics, we would love to get in contact with you. You can you find us on Facebook, Instagram, or you can just leave us an email. And there will also be further events this week, so just check our website or our Facebook or Instagram. And this year is also new, we have a podcast, so there will be a daily episode being uploaded on Spotify. You find all the informations, for example, on Instagram. And then I kindly ask if it's okay for all if we now just take a picture or just do a screenshot. So if it's not okay for you, maybe you can just switch off your cam. So I will just stop